Maybe it's some kind of steampunk fantasy, or maybe it's a reflection on what we already know. In the middle of it, though, it's a very nicely crafted sort of whodunit, as our hero, who turns out to be our hero, and somehow Damon thought that the name Blair would be ideal to represent the best interests of all of us as we negotiate the difficulties of life and come to a heroic conclusion. How did you choose that name?
It's actually for legal reasons. To begin with, all the characters are named exactly the same as the corresponding character in Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. And Wilson Blair was William Blore.
So there we are. No reference to a previous Prime Minister. There we go. Some of us were misled. Okay, so it's a lovely read, and at least one lives in the end. So that's another kind of loveliness too. And it's a great page turner, as you feel very sort of claustrophobic, I think, with the descriptions of the difficulty of A, living, and B, killing others when you're in the confines of a spaceship.
This is the first chapter of 10 Little Astronauts, which is titled 11, for reasons that I hope will become clear if you read the rest of the book. Even before the alarm began to sound, Blair knew in his gut that something was wrong. It was only when he pushed open the hatch of the suspension tank and a few drops of thick cryonic fluid drifted out into the pitch-black hallway that he realised what it was. There was no gravity. That was why his stomach churned. The world, the tiny pool of light spilling from his tank, seemed to swirl. "Owen! Lights!" The computer gave no response. "Owen, turn on the lights!" Nothing. "Owen!" But there was something else now, beyond the cold tank and the dark hallway. Something that no crewman wanted to encounter anywhere, let alone 10 trillion kilometres beyond Earth orbit. It was the smell of burning plastic. Blair hauled himself out of the tank and clawed for the rack of emergency supplies. Even the smallest fire could render the air unbreathable very quickly. Finally managing to find a torch, he tore it from its bracket and pumped the dynamo. A feeble light flickered into life. Without gravity, every direction was downwards. Away from the wall of suspension tanks and handrails, the darkness of the hallway yawned like an endless chasm. Gradually the smell of scorched plastic grew stronger. The end of the passage loomed in the torchlight, and Blair hauled himself hand over hand towards the steel door of Computing Hub 5. He heaved it open, and the torch picked out a blizzard of extinguisher foam. Someone else was already here. Sweeping the torch across the room, he spotted a figure in the far corner, clutching the extinguisher, but the man hung motionless in the air. A ball of blood was forming on his back, held by surface tension to the axe planted between his ribs. A constellation of droplets spread throughout the room. Blair fought the urge to cry for help. This man was dead, and there was every chance that whoever had killed him was still nearby. The clumps of foam suspended in mid-air drifted slowly through the beam of the torch, casting shadows that slunk and flickered across the banks of equipment lining the room. In the event of an emergency, the ship defrosts 10 crew members. Blair wheeled round to see a black-haired man, and a small group behind him, clinging to the handrails at the doorway to the next cryonic bay. "With you and your friend over there," the man continued, gesturing to the corpse. "I make that 11. This is from further towards the middle. It is one I've taken to a couple of events, essentially because it is the one section of the book after the opening that doesn't have spoilers. It's pretty fast-paced. This is at a point where things have calmed down ever so slightly, but still quite a lot of people are dead. And Blair has to go outside the ship to try and fix the computer. Blair made his way to the airlock and took a compression suit from the locker nearby. Lambert held onto Blair's feet while he pulled on the suit, then helped him connect the helmet and life support pack. If he noticed Blair's trembling hands, he said nothing. There was a rush of air through the hollow seams of the suit, the pressure pulling the material tight. Struggling to remain calm, Blair found himself standing straight, arms by his sides, despite floating at a 45-degree angle to the hallway floor. Facing the vacuum outside, the crushing discomfort was at least reassuring. The neck dam's not inflating. Blair ran a thumb around the helmet's collar, resting snug beneath his jaw. I don't think I'm getting any air to the helmet at all. Hang on. Lambert tugged at the hose connecting helmet and pack. There was a mechanical snap, and a blast of cold air ran across the back of Blair's head. Simultaneously, the neck dam filled to a much higher pressure, threatening to close his windpipe. He suddenly remembered someone else, just meters away, the cable tie still locked around their throat. He pushed the image from his mind. Outside the ship, the collar would be the only thing keeping the air in his helmet. It looks as though we'll have to do this without anchors, said Lambert. Actually, I've realised I've possibly started this too early. There may be spoilers, so I'm going to skip ahead. Yeah, there's kind of a section that's fairly safe. Fighting the resistance to the compression suit, Blair pulled himself up the ladder into the airlock compartment. Inside, there were 3 large toggle switches beneath spring-loaded protective covers. He lifted the first cover and flipped the switch, sealing the door between himself and the ship's interior. The second switch started a bank of powerful vacuum pumps. Blair felt the neck dam gradually shift against his skin, the air in his helmet trying to push out past his collarbone. Inside the suit, his skin crawled and prickled as his flesh expanded to fill tiny cavities beneath the fabric. Besides his head, his body was entirely exposed to the vacuum. It was only the mechanical pressure of his suit that prevented his blood from boiling in his veins. A sweaty handprint on his visor steamed and turned to frost. He brushed away the brittle remnants with a gloved hand. When he was quite sure there was no air left in the chamber, he took a deep breath and flipped the final switch. The outer door slid open. "All good?" asked Lambert through the airlock radio. "Seems to be." Arms shaking, Blair began to heave himself out through the hatch into open space. A staring face loomed at him from the edge of the airlock. The eyes were coated with a white film of ice, and a lattice of red frost covered the nose and mouth. As quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, a rigid form bouncing clumsily over the hatch. "What is it?" Lambert's voice was urgent. "What's going on?" It was one of the other team. Blair watched the body drift away, a grim shadow against the blue haze of the ship's engines. They weren't recognisable. The body vanished into the blackness of space. "Are you okay to continue?" Blair looked back at the dim red space of the airlock. "I have to be." Pulling himself over the edge of the airlock hatch, Blair crawled the short distance to the base of the spoke fixing this crew bay to the main body of the ship, a quarter of a kilometre overhead. He knew that if he looked up, he would see the other bays, all stretching out from the fuselage like spokes from a ship's wheel. But he kept his head down. He tried to imagine that there was a wall at his back, something to support him if he lost his grip on the ladder, but he knew there wasn't. The vacuum around him had a presence of its own. Grasping the first rung of the ladder running along the spoke, Blair noticed a gentle force, ever so faint, tugging him away from the ladder and towards the poor frozen crewman, receding into the distance. For a moment, he couldn't work out what was causing this. Then, all at once, it became only too clear. Blair had joked before that there was nowhere to fall, but now it was apparent this wasn't the case. With the ship accelerating once more, albeit slowly, there was a slight sort of gravity, turning the space behind the ship into an endless drop. He would be, in effect, climbing along the underside of a ladder laid out flat. Those magnetic anchors would be sorely missed. Blair clambered around to the other side of the spoke, considering that the same force of acceleration that pulled him away from one side would push him more firmly to the other. However, as he did so, he began to notice spots and flickers from the corner of his eye. Suddenly, sickeningly, he realised why. He ducked back behind the spoke. Though the ship's iron engines could produce only a modest amount of thrust, decades of acceleration had brought the vessel up to a speed of thousands of kilometres per second. Travelling at perhaps 30% of the speed of light, the ship did not so much pass through the interstellar medium as obliterate it. The spots in Blair's vision were atoms of hydrogen and helium, ordinary matter converted into cosmic rays by the ship's astronomical speed. The only shelter from this bombardment of radiation, Enough to kill him in mere minutes, was the spoke itself, but climbing in its shadow would mean clinging to the ladder against the acceleration of the ship. Blair took a deep breath and prepared to make the crawl to the mainframe, allowing himself just one last glance at the comparative safety of the airlock. The dim hatchlight was gone. "Lambert," he spoke through the radio, "is everything all right?" No response. "Lambert, can you hear me? Is the power still on?" Nothing. Blair made a clumsy grab for the line of handholds leading to the airlock and began to make the journey back. "I can't do this without you. If the radio's not working, But it wasn't the radio that was the problem. Blair lifted the cover from the door control and flipped the switch. It sprang lifelessly back into its original position. He flipped it a few more times, desperately trying to trigger the mechanism. "Lambert, you've got to fix this. I'm the engineer, but I can't do anything from out here." There were 20 millimeters of steel between him and the crew. They'd never be able to pick up his voice on the portable radios. He slammed his fist against the door, deliberately at first, but then in a panic. Behind him, the hollowness of space seemed to seep in through the open hatch, the silence of the vacuum ringing in his ears. The light flickered on. As fast as he could, Blair reversed the procedure he'd used to leave the ship, closing the outer hatch, flooding the chamber with air, then opening the door to the crew bay. He flipped the last switch early, and was met with a violent blast of air rushing to fill the chamber. He dragged himself back inside the ship, and found Lambert waiting by the door. "Thanks," Blair gasped. He suddenly noticed that Lambert was wearing a compression suit. "What's with the suit?" he asked. "Awfully hard to get by outside without one." Blair froze. It was not Lambert's voice. It was. Unbound put together a video explaining the premise and who the author is. And then on the strength of that, people can put money in to say, yeah, this sounds like something I'd like to read, give me a copy kind of when it's done, or in some cases if it sees enough support to actually get printed. Mine was 135% funded in the end, so it's done pretty well. Yeah, essentially you need the readers before the book will exist, and that is one of the incentives for supporting it. Unbound gave me a platform, and actually because they're specific to books, it's not like Kickstarter where people just stick any project on there. Unbound are a publisher who curates these things. They're selecting books they think will succeed. So if you're looking at their site, there's a much better chance that there'll be things you're actually interested in or could conceivably be interested in, rather than the, like, I'm making a big potato salad. But yeah, the authors are largely reaching their own audience. And it helped that this is kind of my first book with a publisher, but I think it was my 8th book altogether, because I'd self-published a bunch before that.
Yeah, and that helps.
But you're very good at marketing, then.
I try. I mean, the Hampshire Writers Society seem to agree.
I think there are several sponsors here tonight, actually.
Oh yeah, no, it's thanks to everyone who.